So hi everyone, very good to have you all here. My name is Yvan Sadje. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Caribbean Seabird Working Group. And I'll present very briefly about this webinar and about the 2023 Caribbean Seabird Census effort that we're trying to organize for next year. So
you want to give people about another few minutes just
another few minutes? Okay.
Yeah.
We can just look at the map and see how many colonies are in the Caribbean. So this map for the people who are here is I think is a map from the West Indies Seabird Atlas that was collated from data from the 1990s and maybe up to the 2000s. So it's not up to date, but it's a good idea of seabird colonies in the region. A great number of seabird colonies in the region. I think a few are missing, actually. Okay, I don't know what time it is, Anne, but maybe I'll just start. It looks like the number of people is not increasing, so.
Yeah, we have 30 attendees, and that's pretty good, so I'd go ahead.
Right, so I'll just start now. So, as you all know, if you're participating in this webinar, we the Seabird Working Group are trying to push for Caribbean, what we call the Caribbean Seabird Census for 2023. So why is that? Well, because we all of the seabird community in the Caribbean know that we need data, up-to-date data, current data on seabird metapopulations, habitats, threats, to inform conservation plan, to inform conservation actions in each of the countries and regionally as in the Caribbean region as a whole. So what we're trying to do is not really to have the most precise census, but we count as many Caribbean colonies as possible next year in 2023. And how do we plan on doing that? Well, is by engaging with you, seabird experts, also volunteers to count colonies in the region using standard and, very importantly, compatible methods across the region. And part of this, sorry, to support this effort, we're organizing webinars, trying to get as many as possible this year. Last month, we had one led by Chris Haney on seabird identification. This one today is on basic concepts, really the basis of monitoring and census. Next month, Natalie Collier of EPIC is going to present a more precise methodology for field censuses, like transects, plots, whole colony count, counting from boat, counting from islands. Then we're going to move into data recording and management, trying to share and discuss methods, data sheets, apps like phone apps, things like that to record data and also manage it. Eventually, we'll discuss new survey methods like drones or acoustic surveys, and then jump into data analysis, and then hopefully in January 2023, start the census. So this webinar, the purpose of this webinar is really to introduce, well, the Caribbean Seabird Census, which I just did, encourage your participation, encourage to learn more about methodology, about how to count seabirds, and also suggest ways to design your censuses, your surveys, and things to consider when you're planning for that seabird census. As a reminder, the Caribbean Seabird Monitoring Manual is available in English, in French, and Spanish. You will find it on Birds Caribbean webpage, on the Seabird webpage. In the chat box, I shared the link, so it should be available hopefully to everybody. If not, we'll share it back at the end. And on this, I'll let Hannah talk. And then it's going to be, it's going to be Anne Sutton.
Okay, Thanks, Ivan, and hello, everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar. Unfortunately, we're having some internet issues, so I'm going to turn off my camera, but you can all still hear me. So why study seabirds? Well, the sad reality is that between 1950 and 2010, monitored seabird populations globally have declined by almost 70%. While many small populations have been observed to increase, these increases are swamped by large decreases in fewer but larger populations. These results come from data gathered on just 19% of the world's seabirds, but they probably apply to all seabird species. We just don't know. In many cases, there are no data available. The only other global study of seabird population trends, which was published in 2012, found that 1/3 of seabird species are threatened, at least half species are in decline, and at least 4 species are known to be extinct. So threats to seabirds are increasing steadily over time, and the industrialization of fishing has depleted seabirds' food sources. Other threats include entanglement in fishing gear and pollution in the ocean. Next slide, please, Ivan. So tropical seabirds are long-lived, and most species lay just 1 egg per year. Up until the last 10,000 years, they could avoid most predators by simply nesting on islands that lacked predatory mammals. Seabirds are extremely sensitive to disturbance of their nesting sites, harvesting of eggs and chicks for food, and predation by invasive mammalian predators, including humans. So to persist as a relevant part of the natural ecosystem and human economies, most Caribbean seabirds now require direct, coordinated, and long-term interventions by conservationists. These interventions must be informed by current, accurate information on the status and distribution of seabirds. Next slide, please. I think we may have skipped a slide. I'm not sure. Anyway.
Yeah, you did skip a slide. Do you want to go back? Just go back 2 slides, Yvonne.
Right. So the Caribbean once teemed with millions of breeding seabirds, but their populations have declined substantially as human populations have increased. Colonies shrank or disappeared due to loss or damage of habitat. This could be from development and disturbance, hurricanes and storms, which of course we suffer in the Caribbean, as well as invasive plant species. Not to mention disturbance of nesting sites where adults, which are startled, leave their eggs and chicks, as well as the harvest of eggs and chicks for food, and the introduction of exotic predators such as rats, cats, dogs, pigs, goats, mice, and mongooses. Unfortunately, all of these threats are increasing rapidly as human population increase, and they're being exacerbated by climate change. And finally, tropical oceans in the Caribbean are characterized by low productivity, which means that seabirds must travel potentially great distances to find productive patches or hunt in association with subsurface predators like tuna and dolphin. I'm going to hand it over to Anne now.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm just saying hello, but I'm going to turn off my camera because of my internet problems. Yes, so like when we think about monitoring seabirds in the Caribbean, what are we thinking about? Well, from a regional perspective, we really want to get an idea of what is going on over the whole Caribbean, because the seabirds that you may see on your island may not have actually been born or on your island, with a lot of evidence of exchange between colonies, movements between colonies, And so the whole Caribbean is a meta population for many birds. So for example, I banded sooty terns on Morant Keys in Jamaica that turned up breeding in Puerto Rico. So knowing what is happening at any individual colony, you need to understand what is happening in the whole region. So that's something that's really important, and one of the driving factors why we were trying to get use this Caribbean seabird census to get a snapshot of what is going on everywhere. From a local perspective, you really want to know which species you have, how important your colony is. I mean, if you've got more than 1% of the global population, that might qualify your seabird colony at the Ramsar site. You're interested in trends, like whether any conservation actions that you're carrying out are working, and also doing seabird census is a really good way to engage your local populations and to support enforcement as well where that's necessary. Next slide. All right, so I want to really talk today about the sort of things that you will need to consider if you're considering designing a survey. And they're really the same things that for any survey, but there's some special things that you need to think about when you're thinking about seabirds. So in terms, the first thing, of course, is to look at the literature. And Birds Caribbean has spent many years putting together quite a lot of literature about our Caribbean seabirds. And without Birds Caribbean's efforts, there would be virtually no information about Caribbean seabirds. So we have a book of species accounts, we have a book of island accounts, we have this seabird monitoring manual, and there's also the seabird breeding atlas for the Lesser Antilles. So there's a lot of information out there. And there may be information about your colonies, or there may not, both of which would encourage you to take more action. As with any survey or any action, deciding where you want to go, your goals and objective is the next step. It's really important to understand what you're trying to achieve and what the outputs will be, like how you're going to use the data when you've got it. So having decided on that, you need to think about where your seabird colonies are, the timing of your surveys, the resources that you're going to need to implement them, the methods, the equipment you're going to need. Very importantly, you need to consider about how you're going to minimize disturbance to the colony, how you're going to train. And
putting on a webinar right now.
Yeah, Lisa, can you turn off your microphone? And then how you're going to analyze and report, and also you may need to consider whether you need any special permits to allow you to do what you need to do, and permissions from landowners. Next slide. So your goals and objectives, as sort of indicated before, the species that you have, how many nesting pairs by species. And this is important that we think about nesting pairs rather than just the number of seabirds or the number of chicks. We really, in order to be able to understand what's going on, we need to understand how many pairs you have. Sometimes that's also called a number of apparently occupied nests. So are the numbers changing? How important is your relative both to other colonies in your area and relative to other colonies in the Caribbean? What are the environmental factors that are either supporting your colony or threatening your colony? And what are the conservation needs? Next slide. So more detailed goals and objectives, the distribution, relative abundance of species, population trends over time. Is there breeding success? This relates to whether your colony may be a source that is supplying birds to other areas, or a sink where there may be a lot of breeding species, but if they're not surviving, then that's just a sink and it's not contributing to the regional population. If you have threatened species, what is their status? As I mentioned before, conservation actions, community engagement, and the potential perhaps for use of this colony for nature-based tourism, and also the relationship to coral reef health, which is something that has most recently been discovered that actually coral reefs survive much better in relation to where they're close to seabird colonies. So I think this is something we really need to make our decision makers aware of. Next slide. In terms of designing your survey, what are you looking at? The species of interest and the locations. When, the timing is important, both because you need to fit in both when the birds are breeding and they're easier to count and present on the colony, and whether that's actually a time when you can get to a colony because of bad sea conditions. And then how are you going to do the survey? You need to think about access. Can you get onto the colony from a boat or by land, or do you just have to look at it from a distance? You need, as I mentioned before, to be very cognizant of how to minimize disturbance, what human resources you need. Do people need training, what equipment, and funding? And Yvonne did not mention this, but we don't currently, as Birds Caribbean, have funding to support a big regional census. We are looking at small sources of funding. We have a little bit that's going to help us coordinate this census, and we're looking for more. We would love to have a big census so that we could provide funding for all of you. But in the meantime, we're encouraging people who want to participate to look for their own sources of funding. We also need to think about whether, in terms of the species or the area, whether there's any special techniques we need to use. Next slide. Timing. So when do you want to time? Is just before eggs are ready to hatch. So the birds are present on the breeding colony. They're very attached to their nests, and the chances of doing damage is minimal because the chicks aren't running around. Some species have nests in a single pulse, like some terns and some boobies. Some sooty terns nest more than once a year, like they nest every 9 months. Some nest every 12 months. And those are easier to serve. Things that nest in a single pulse are easier to survey because you just need to go when they're breeding. It's much more complicated to deal with species such as some boobies that have extended nesting seasons, and there's a few of them nesting all around the year. And that makes it very difficult to know when to go and survey and to be able to interpret what the data mean. And nesting seasons vary with colony. So, for example, in Jamaica, we have brown noddies nesting on the Morant Keys. Their peak nesting season is late May to June, and then 100 kilometers away in the Portland Bight Keys, the colony there really nests in June, July. So, they're even in the small geographic scale, there can be variation in nesting seasons. Next slide. So just to stress this, doing seabird surveys is very risky for seabirds. If it's necessary for you to go onto a colony to do a count, there's many ways that you can cause damage. Sometimes people step on eggs. Sometimes just being there scares the adults away and they'll abandon their nest. Heat exposure is really a big threat. Within 15 to 20 minutes, an egg that is left out in the direct sun with no shade can become addled, so that the chick can die. Also, when you go in a colony and the parents leave the nest, then predators like laughing gulls move in really rapidly to seize eggs. They're just sitting there waiting for the chance, and you may create it. Other birds can cause indirect damage to eggs. For example, like when frigate birds are disturbed and they come off the nest, they very often, just as they flap and take off, they kick their own eggs off the nest and they break. And then once you have chicks, then they start running around when they're disturbed. They can run into other adults' territories and get pecked to death by adults who are just being territorial. So very, very important to consider how you minimize disturbance. So you don't go into colonies unnecessarily. You never go into colonies in the hottest time of the day. You plan how to minimize the disturbance, and you train the observers and all your observers to be careful, respectful, and minimize the amount of time you spend in a colony. Next slide. So thinking about survey protocols, like Birds Caribbean has this sort of idea of levels of monitoring. And it's the same with the Caribbean Water Bird Census. So we have to do level 1 is what we call a reconnaissance survey. You don't know what's there, you're going to go and have a look and see how you're going to plan your surveys. Level 2 is more detailed counts. So in this case, you might, if it's a reasonable colony and you have enough staff, you might just be able to count all the nests. You may be able to do that from the ground, or if it's inaccessible, you may do it remotely. If it's a very large colony and you don't have enough people, you may have to do some sampling. And if all else fails, there's a few other things that you can do just to get an idea of how many birds are there, like a flush count. So somebody walks into the colony and somebody else tries to count how many birds fly up. You can also, if you're at a location where seabirds are flying by, you can count how many are passing by, or you can just count the roosts. These ones are not really going to tell, they can only tell you very vaguely about how many birds are there or what's going on. And level 3 is much more detailed. We might be looking at survival, we might be looking at colony dynamics, the timing, reproductive success, how chicks grow, where adults forage. There's a lot of good questions and many interesting things. But for today, and for the census, we're really just focusing on level 1 and level 2. And level 3 is for the future. Next slide. So looking at a reconnaissance survey, level 1, that's your preliminary assessment. You do your literature review, you get to the colony, and that in itself is a learning experience, like trying to work out what you need to get there. When you arrive, can you land, and thinking about all those sorts of things. If you can, you get an idea of where the breeding birds are and an idea of the number, what stage in the nesting cycle it is. Are the birds in pairs? Do they have eggs? Do they have chicks? And how easy or difficult was it to carry out your surveys? All this information is what you need to plan your future surveys. Next slide. So, as I say, level 2 is about counting, and that a lot of your method depends on what you're counting. So things that nest on the ground are easiest ones. If they nest in trees, depends on how big the tree is. Like a small tree may be easy. If it's a large tree, it can be very difficult to get in and count. And of course, like counting from the ground has many different implications as well, because it's very different to walk across a nice open sandy sooty tern colony and count the nests were compared to a pelican colony, which may be in a mangrove swamp, and you're trying to negotiate red mangrove roots to walk through the colony. So very different types of approaches. And other colonies on cliffs, you may have to count them from a boat. And then if you can't, for places where at least on a cliff, you can see the nests, but in other places you may not be able to get on a colony, and you're just going to do a remote count, just counting the number of birds in flight from a boat or from another viewpoint. So next slide. Ideally, we would go for a total colony census. This is suitable when you've got enough manpower and access so that you can go through a colony and count how many birds there are. It may involve just one person counting a small discrete colony, like a royal tern aggregation is very dense. You can easily count how many birds there are just with one person. Whereas if you've got a sooty tern colony with hundreds of thousands of birds, you might be able to divide it up. If you've got a lot of people, you can divide it up into sections and count it by sections, or you can have a line of people walking through and and count it that way. Or if you don't have that resources, you may do some sampling, and that's using things like circular plots. And that we're going to be talking about that, more about that in the next webinar. So the advantage of this, of course, is you get a good number of the nesting pairs, and you can get a good idea of the stage in the nesting cycle. The disadvantage is there's a risk of disturbance, and it takes time and people. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a typical data form that has been developed by EPIC with the species and a photograph in case people are unsure, and spaces to say how many birds, how many chicks, and how many fledglings, etc. So this is a sample form that we can certainly share with everybody. Next slide. So for cavity nesting and burrowing seabirds, it's another challenge. They're not easily seen from from outside. So first thing you have to do is locate nests. Either sometimes you can just see them, sometimes you may need to use playback or even thermal imagery to find where the nests are. And then to actually be able to do an estimate of what's going on, you may need special techniques to be able to use something like a camera trap to see what the activity is. You may need to use banding to identify the birds that you see and do other measurements and survival and so on while you're doing that. And of course, in order to make sure that you don't double count nests, you need to mark your nests at least with some flagging. Next slide. So remote counts from the boat, it's pretty hard. You don't need people. You need people who don't get seasick easily. You need to do it in the peak breeding season if you can. Obviously, the advantage is that you have minimal disturbance. The disadvantage is hard to count. You're counting birds in flight, so you really need to train people to count birds in flight, and training people to estimate numbers. It's amazing how you can increase your accuracy about estimating numbers, either using little count apps that help you to practice, or just doing just counting things like a handful of beans on a table or something like that. Next slide. So looking at survival, we might do some banding, for example. This would require more regular visits, but you need to remember that anything that requires you actually handling birds needs a lot more training, needs more permitting, and certainly nobody should be handling birds if they're not fully trained to do that. We can, through some of these, through banding, we can look at survival, we can look at causes of failure. While we're in the colony, we can also collect information about the forage food sources, because when you handle a chick, it will often throw up what it's been eating. So that'll give you a good idea of the food source. And we can also get information about longevity, because for many of these Caribbean seabirds, there's no data from the region about how long they live. Next slide. Oh, and of course, when you band, you can also get information about dispersal. I mean, we banded masked boobies on Pedro Keys in Jamaica, and they turned up in Mexico, Cuba, and New Jersey. Don't know what they were doing in New Jersey, but anyway, I think it must have been carried up there by a storm. Yeah, next slide. There's a lot of new technologies. These are not yet included in our manual, but we hope that one day we'll get this in there. Things like using drones with thermal cameras, or just drones with ordinary cameras, automatic sound recorders that can pick up the sounds of which birds are there. Nest cameras can tell you what's going on especially at a burrowing bird nest. And then for long-term surveys and movement studies, banding, and also tracking devices. All of these have advantages and disadvantages, but can really provide a lot more information. Next slide. So as well, while you're on the colony, it's really important not just to count the birds, but to see what is happening with the environment. We do have a site description form that you can use. It's in the manual. So looking at the relationship between the seabirds and their environment, changes, things that might have contributed to changes in the population, changes in habitat quality and threats. Next slide. And looking at some things like covariates that can also influence nesting, like the changes in cover of vegetation type, things like slope and elevation aspect, and very importantly, invasive species. Like presence and absence of invasive species will tell you a lot about what is going on with your colony. If there's one thing that you can do to increase the number of nesting pairs on any colony, is to identify and remove any invasive species. So, and there's some simple techniques which we can share of ways that you can actually detect invasive species, especially rats, cats, dogs, mice, raccoons, all these things, and chickens. So we need to be very cognizant and make sure to record if we see any of them. Next slide. Excuse me. And while many of these colonies that you're going to visit may not have been visited very often by other biologists, so it's important to collect data on anything else that you see. I mean, sea turtle nesting is really important. Many of these colonies, these seabird colonies, where they have suitable sandy beaches, are also sea turtle nesting areas. And very interestingly, many of these Caribbean seabird nesting keys also support rare endemic lizards and snakes. So if you happen to see a lizard or a snake on your island, then take a photograph, because it might be a new species. But as I said, make sure you collect data on any invasive species you might see. Next slide. What sort of resources do we need? Of course, it depends entirely on what you're doing, but the general sorts of things that you're going to need to think about is the people that you need, the transportation, how you're going to get to the key and move around on the key or the colony when you get there, the sorts of field equipment you might need, some of it expensive, like binoculars and scopes, some of it simple but really useful, like clicker counters, little devices that you push a button, and every time you push the button, it adds a number on a very analog little scale, a cheap but very useful piece of it, any counts that you may be doing. Range finders, of course, also very useful, especially if you're needing to try and estimate the area of a colony in order to, when you're doing sampling. Field clothes, really important. These places are really hot and you can get wet. So fast drying clothes, suitable shoes that you can that can go in the water and dry out, don't get full of sand. Hats, rainwear. You also need field guides. We do actually have a little seabird identification card that's useful for if you've got inexperienced people. But sometimes you might see a seabird that you don't recognize and a funny plumage. So having a good field guide with you is always important. And then things like general field supplies, waterproof notebooks, pencils. For me, always pencil on a string, because I will put it down and forget it. Anyway, field forms, clipboards, sunscreen, cameras, really important. Flagging if you're going to need to know where you were, markers, measuring tapes, those sorts of things. And for most other more specific surveys, you'll need more specific types of equipment. Next slide. Training. Yes, so in the past, Birds Caribbean has arranged seabird training workshops, and they're well attended. And we would love to do more in the future, but we don't currently have any funding. But if we manage to find it, then we will try and get some workshops done as soon as we can. These webinars are a way to also help to support training. And we have training materials on our website. We would love to hear from you about anything that we can do, other types of webinars, any other types of remote training that we can provide, or any support that we can also provide to help. What we found in the past is that although we've trained many people at workshops, it takes extra experience for people to feel really confident about doing their own surveys. But if you find yourself in a position where you do need more advice, I'm sure any of the Seabird Working Group members would be very happy to provide you with advice and support and to discuss what you want to do. Next slide. Data management. Yep. If you don't manage your data and you don't do anything with it, it might as well be thrown down the toilet. So plan it from where you start. You're going to do all this hard work. You're going to be in difficult conditions, and you're putting birds at risk. So it's your responsibility to make sure that the data is well used. So you need to think about the metadata, the databases you're going to use to store the data, the archives, like whether you're going to use eBird to collect data. And we do have support from eBird to make it more, in the future, to make it more of a better tool for monitoring things like colonial birds. And also you need to think about how you're going to share your reports with the decision makers, the people who are working with you, the communities and scientists, so that they understand why they need to protect seabirds. Next slide. So our support, as I mentioned, we would love to do some training, but in the meanwhile, the Seabird Monitoring Manual is there, and the link is in the chat. Birds Caribbean has seabird identification cards that you can get. We have seabird posters. There are several books that are being produced by Birds Caribbean and by our partners, accounts of species or identification guides like this one for the birds of the transboundary grenadines. We have the working group listserv. We have, as I said before, we would love to provide technical support, and if we can find funding, we will certainly be sharing that with you. Next slide. So thank you, everybody. There's been a lot of progress so far. Like when I first started with the Seabird Working Group, there were very few people, and it's really heartening to see how many people are on this call and how many people are now interested in seabirds. So thank you for that, and thank you for your support. And next slide. Yeah, join us in 2023. We need your support. Birds need you, and I think this is a really exciting project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Thank you very much. So we'll open for questions. I think you can either ask questions in the chat or in the question and answer. They will either show up for everybody or not. So feel free to ask questions. I don't think you can speak, but feel free to type in the questions and we'll be happy to answer them.
This is Jennifer Wheeler hiding in incognito as Lisa Sorensen. You can raise your hand if you have a question that's kind of hard to type, and we can look to call on you. But yes, please also feel free to type in some questions either under chat or Q&A, and we can discuss things. So standing by, again, raise your hand or type in either of those places and we'll see you, I hope. One question right now was Troy wanting the link to the manual. Oh, also Pavia wanted that. So yes, let's resend the link to the manual, Yvonne, if you don't mind doing that. Ooh, World Chocolate Day.
I just shared the link to the Seabird Resources webpage, and you can find the manual if you scroll down a little bit. If you go down the page, it's in monitoring manuals and handbooks. you will find the 3 versions, English, Spanish, and French there. And as well, reports and other documents on that page.
Anne, I had a question, and this is really not just for Anne, it's for everyone out there who has had some experience designing surveys and pulling together a field team. How young is it? I mean, obviously, small children are not appropriate in seabird colonies, but have you been able, anyone out there been able to work with teenagers? Are they typically mature enough to undertake these counts? I'm just wondering about high school level types, 16, 17-year-olds.
I don't see why not. I've never have tried that, but I don't see why not if they're properly trained. Yeah, it's just, have enough supervision, and again, it depends very much on the species and the colony and the activity. But yeah, I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that.
Okay, there's another question from Josmar in Venezuela, and he wanted to know, will there be funds for the 2023 census, pointing out that getting to islands and archipelagos is expensive.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, we don't currently
And
have
you wanna,
those funds. Yeah, we
discuss again the funding situation?
Yeah, so the funding situation is that we're currently looking for funds. We're looking for a sugar daddy or a sponsor or a source of grant funds to support this. But in the meantime, we're encouraging anybody who wants to participate to look for their own funding. We would certainly be able to provide, like, we might be able to provide so at least moral support to say your project is part of an ongoing activity, and we may be able to provide some matching funding. But Jennifer, maybe you can also chime in on that.
Sure. Yes, one of the difficulties forever has been that our seabirds in the Caribbean tend to be pan-tropical. They occur all around the globe. And as a result, oftentimes they don't stand out as highly imperiled. They don't make those lists. Of course, we all know that in the region, they are highly imperiled because what was once millions, hundreds of thousands can get down to numbers that are just very, very small compared to the past and shrinking. So that's our challenge. We are trying to think as creatively as possible, tying to sources of funding that look at maybe not seabirds specifically, but more at the usual things like climate change or sustainable livelihoods, or as Anne mentioned, ecosystem health, tying what we are finding out is an important link between nutrient cycling with seabirds and the corals. So we're looking, but unfortunately we don't have anything wonderful to announce. We may have a small grants program similar to the Caribbean Waterbird Census to help people get into the field. But unfortunately, as Josmar just pointed out, getting into the field to a wetland is a lot different than getting on a boat to a remote island. So we know it's expensive. We're just going to keep looking and try to just see what we can find. Okay, we have a Pavia has written again, and she says, our club is taking a boat trip on the 16th to the Booby Rocks. We will be viewing the islands from the boat and hoping for calm weather. Do any of you have special things to look for aside from the obvious bird IDs and counts? Pavia, do you want to tell us a little bit about Booby Rocks? And I have to obviously let you talk, don't I? All right. Where are you? Allowed to talk. Pavia, you should be able to talk.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. This will be my first trip to the Booby Rocks. So I'm going out with Carolyn Wardle, who is an experienced birder, you all know, I'm sure. There are probably be about 13, 14 of us going. We'll all be taking cameras, binoculars, scopes, and just hoping to see nesting birds. We think or Carolyn thinks it's the right time for seeing the nesting colonies there. And it's been a long time since anybody has gone there, so we're not quite sure what we're going to find. So is there anything in particular that we should look for, that the scientists could recommend that we specially look for?
Anne, do you want to field this, and then Hannah could weigh in?
Yes, well, I think just that's, you're just going to be counting from the boat. So I would think that the numbers, the best estimate you can get of the numbers by species. And I don't know which boobies you're going to see, whether there's anything, if it's like frigate birds where you can estimate the age, but basically numbers by species, and just record what time you started and what time you ended, and any observations about the habitat. I think that's what I would suggest, but maybe
Right.
Hannah can add some stuff.
We'll use eBird to report, and we will do written reports as well, because our phones probably won't work that far out.
Yeah.
So we'll do good descriptions of the area, what we see, habitat, all those different things that are necessary.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would say that just do a reconnaissance survey,
Mhm.
and really think about the time of day that you're going to be there. And if you're able to do more than one trip, that would be great. And maybe you could try a different time of day and then compare and see, perhaps there was more of this species flying around at this time of day and that species at another time.
Well, it's quite far out. It's a 4 or 5 hour boat trip. So
wow.
it's a couple of hours away from New Providence, or at least an hour and a half boat ride away. So
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how often we'll be able to go, but certainly we could plan a trip for the 2023 plan,
Excellent.
the census. If this is successful, we're going in the morning, starting at 8, so we should get there by 9:30, 10. Yeah, and then.
Are you
Sorry.
suggesting, Hannah, that in addition to writing down the birds seen, it would be helpful to write down, like, in what time they were seen? Like, you could say the first hour we saw this, the second hour we saw this.
Okay.
Yes, because some species are more active at particular times of day, or they may be. May
Right.
not. But it would be useful then to just note down, between 9 and 10, we saw X number of this species. And,
Right.
you know,
Okay.
for the time you're there.
Right. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and then I guess I would just reiterate what I saw on one of Anne's slides. Just whatever clues or things you can pick up by looking at the island, looking beyond the birds. Do you see, again, I have no mental picture of this place, but do you see where someone's built a campfire? Do you see where someone's might have camped or visited, or you know,
Yeah, 'cause
those
it-
just what's going on out there, kind of.
Well, I think they're all uninhabited.
One hopes,
They're
yes.
small
that
cape,
doesn't-
right?
Yeah, there could be visitors that come
That's true.
along and
right.
unexpected visitors and such. So one hopes you won't see signs of human use, but it's good to keep an eye out on
We
that.
will make note for sure.
A question just came in from Elijah Edwards, I think, and he wrote, "Hi, I'm currently working on an externship with National Geographic and the Nature Conservancy, and I am really interested in learning more about issues in seabird conservation to come up with creative community-based solutions. What resources and contacts would you suggest connecting with to learn more about how to help?" And Yvonne, would you like to?
Yeah, I just clicked answer live because I thought we had to do it, but yeah, I can answer to that. I'm going to share in the chat, Elijah, the link to the listserv. The listserv, it's a groups.io. You need to register with your email. And so I'm not going to reply directly to your answer here because I think although it's a great question, it would take a lot of time because there are a lot of people with different ideas and different solutions. But I encourage you to join the listserv, you and everybody in this chat if you're in this webinar. And then feel free to send an email to the group and people can reply to you directly or share with everyone. But in terms of resources, so you may be able to find some information on the webpage, the Birds Caribbean webpage. Seabird community, community focused work. EPIC is also doing environmental protection in the Caribbean. Is also working in the Grenadines with community there. So these are good places to look for information. So I'm sharing in the chat the link to the listserv to send email to the whole group. And Anne and Hannah, if you have other answers or Jennifer, feel free to answer too.
Well, I was going to mention another question came in very similar from Grace Witten. A more general question: how do you engage with local communities when doing this work? And both of these questions are fabulous because that's where conservation lies, with local communities. And the answers are, yes, many different answers, because this is a big topic. At the recent Birds Caribbean American Ornithological Society conference in Puerto Rico, the theme of engaging people, local people, came up again and again and again, and how that's absolutely essential to conservation. And I guess, again, not to try to answer this, but you know, engaging local communities can be everything from engaging them in helping you with counts, engaging them with helping you understand threats, engaging them to help combat the threats, engaging them to be voices for their resources to decision makers. So there's lots of different forms of engagement. And as Yvonne mentioned, our listserv is a great way to converse. And then also, I think if we can find the links to the abstracts that presented at the conference about local engagement with seabirds. And the World Seabird Union is a collection of seabird groups, not just from the Caribbean, but from around the world. And this same topic of community engagement has come up everywhere from Iceland to Tasmania to the Falklands. So it's a universal topic. And so hopefully we can help you find abstracts to talks and people that are working on the type of engagement that you have in mind. So Yvonne, maybe you can just type in seabirds.net into the chat. That's the way to find the World Seabird Union. And then again, if people ask specific questions, we can try to answer them through emails. Any other questions, comments? as we proceed with these webinars, this series of webinars, we do want to hear back on what you thought. Clearly, a webinar is no substitute for going out into the field together, but we're trying to do the best we can. So we'd like to hear from you if this was a good time of day. Is this a good format? What else do you want to see? We have a whole lineup coming, but if you have other ideas that you didn't see on that list, great to hear from you. All right, why don't we give it another minute, and then Anne, Hannah, or Yvonne, if you want to make any closing statements. Prepare yourself mentally.
It's too much pressure, Jennifer.
Okay, well then maybe you can just, I don't know, do a little interpretive dance. So let me turn on your camera. Just kidding.
I will not do that.
All right, well,
But
how
thank
about
you
you
very
just
much
say
for,
the usual things.
Yeah, I'll just thank, and on behalf of the Seabird Working Group, thank you very much to all 45 participants and panelists for being there. It's great to see that people are registering and turning up for these webinars. As Jennifer just said, it doesn't replace in-person training, like training in the field, but we're trying to get to that. So as Anne said, we're looking for funding. Every time we have a core Seabird group meeting, we discuss that. So we keep in mind funding. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us.